The envelope was already on the kitchen table when Senna Okafor got home. Not sealed, not addressed, just sitting there, open, like whoever left it wanted her to find it immediately. Wanted her to know they weren't even trying to hide it anymore. She set her keys down. She didn't pick up the envelope right away. She stood at the counter and looked at it the way you look at something when you already know what it contains, when your body registers the information before your brain does. The paper inside had her uncle's law firm letterhead. Devereaux and Associates. She'd seen that letterhead her whole life. On the wall behind her father's desk. On the folder he kept in the fireproof safe. On the birthday cards Leonard Devereaux sent every year without fail, even after her father died. The letter said she had 30 days to vacate the property. Senna read it twice. Then she folded it back along the original crease, set it inside the envelope, and went upstairs to pack. She didn't scream. She didn't throw anything. She'd done 2 tours with the 82nd Airborne. She'd learned early that the people who screamed in moments like this were the ones who hadn't been paying attention. And Senna had been paying attention for a long time. Her father, Winston Okafor, had built the house himself, not with contractors, with his own hands and the hands of his 2 brothers, on a plot of land in Marlowe County, North Carolina, that his grandfather had purchased in 1951 and never sold, no matter how many times people came knocking. The house wasn't grand. It was solid. 3 bedrooms, a wraparound porch, a root cellar, and a workshop out back where Winston spent his evenings refinishing furniture he bought from estate sales and resold for twice what he paid. He understood the value of patience. He understood that things people discarded often had more worth than the people discarding them could see. Senna was 12 when her mother left. She was 20 when her father got sick. She was 22 when he died, and she sat in the front pew at Mount Calvary Baptist and stared at the casket and felt the specific kind of cold that has nothing to do with temperature. Her uncle Prescott Okafor sat 2 rows behind her. She could feel him there. Prescott and Winston had not spoken in 4 years. A disagreement about money, the way it always is with families, dressed up in other language, until you forget what you were actually fighting about. But Prescott came to the funeral, stood at the grave, hugged her afterward, and said if she needed anything, she only had to ask. She should have paid more attention to that offer. Winston's will had been filed with the county probate court. He'd been careful about it. Careful the way men who've watched their fathers lose things tend to be careful. The house, the land, the workshop, and whatever was in the savings account went to Senna in full, with a clause that if she ever chose to sell, she had to offer it first to family at fair market value. Prescott contested it 11 months after Winston was buried. The grounds were technical. Something about the notary's certification, something about the date, something about a second document that his attorney, Leonard Devereaux, the same Leonard who'd sent birthday cards every year, claimed superseded the original. Senna was stationed at Fort Bragg when the first filing came through. She was in the field when the second one came. By the time she was back stateside and understood what was happening, Prescott had been granted temporary administrative authority over the estate pending the dispute. And then her father's savings account was empty. She hired an attorney with what was left in her military account. The attorney told her the case was complicated. She hired a second attorney. The second one told her the same thing but charged more to say it. The court process moved the way court processes move when one party has resources and the other doesn't. Not fast, not fair, not anything resembling the way it's supposed to work. Senna was 24 years old, living in a barracks room, watching her inheritance get processed like paperwork. And then the 30-day notice arrived. She took what she could fit in the back of her truck. The things that mattered weren't furniture. They were a photograph of her father at her high school graduation, squinting into the sun and grinning like the sun was losing. A copy of their eyes were watching God with his handwriting in the margins. Not notes exactly, more like arguments he was having with the characters. A compass that had belonged to his grandfather, brass, with an engraving on the back that said, "Find your way home." And from the workshop, a small end table he'd been refinishing the week before he was diagnosed. He hadn't finished it. The left leg was still stripped, still waiting. She wrapped it in a moving blanket and slid it behind the seat. She sat in the driveway for 10 minutes. The house looked back at her the way it always had. Plain, patient, hers. She drove away without looking in the rearview mirror. If you know what you're leaving, you don't need to watch it disappear. You have to understand something about Senna Okafor. She wasn't the kind of person who carried bitterness like luggage, dragging it everywhere, letting it slow her down. She'd been around people like that in the army. People so full of what happened to them that they couldn't move forward, couldn't deploy their energy toward anything except the wound. She understood it. She just couldn't afford it. What she carried instead was clarity. She knew what had been taken. She knew who took it. And she knew, in the specific quiet way of someone who has been trained to assess situations without emotion, that the story wasn't over. She moved to Asheville. She got a job with a construction firm. She'd learned framing and foundation work from her father by the time she was 15. And within a year, she was supervising sites. She took a real estate licensing course at night. Not because she had a plan exactly, more because she understood that land was the thing, had always been the thing. And, if she was going to rebuild, she needed to understand the architecture of how it all worked. She learned zoning law. She learned probate law. She found a third attorney, a woman named Kay Finley, who worked out of a converted bungalow in Weaverville, and who looked at the case files and said, quietly, "This is wrong and I think we can prove it." Kay charged half what the first two attorneys had and worked twice as hard. They found the problem in the notary records, not in Winston's will, in the document Prescott's attorney had used to challenge it. The certification date on the so-called superseding document was 3 days before the notary in question had been licensed by the state of North Carolina. A small thing, a clerical thing, the kind of thing that only matters if someone is looking, and no one had been looking because Senna had been in the field, and then in grief, and then in a legal system that moves slowly by design. Kay filed the motion. The court scheduled a hearing. And then something else happened. Something Senna hadn't planned for and couldn't have manufactured. The first attorney she'd hired, the one who'd told her the case was complicated and done nothing, got disbarred. Not over her case. Over other cases, other clients, a pattern of negligence that had been building for years. When the Barr investigation went public, a journalist in Raleigh started pulling threads, and one of the threads led to Leonard Devereaux and a series of estate cases in Marlowe County where the pattern was similar. Property belonging to black families, challenged after death, transferred through legal maneuvering to relatives or associates of the deceased who had the money to sustain a court fight. It wasn't a conspiracy. It didn't need to be. It was just the way things worked, quietly, for a long time, when no one was watching closely enough. The journalist piece ran on a Tuesday. By Friday, the Marlowe County Probate Court had flagged 7 cases for review. Senna's was one of them. She didn't find out from the journalist. She found out from Kay, who called her at 6 in the morning and said, "I need you to come in." The hearing took 4 hours. Prescott sat across the room with Leonard Devereaux and a young associate from the firm who kept clicking his pen until the judge told him to stop. Senna sat beside Kay and looked at the wall above the judge's head, not at Prescott. She'd made that choice deliberately. If she looked at him, she'd feel something, and she didn't want to feel anything in that room except steady. The judge voided the contested document. Insufficient notarization, she said, which was the legal way of saying it was fraudulent, which was the accurate word that the judge didn't use, because courts are careful with accurate words. The house reverted to Senna. The savings account was a different matter. That took another 8 months, 2 more filings, and a civil suit that Kay handled on contingency. In the end, Prescott settled. He didn't admit wrongdoing. They never do, but he paid. Not everything. Not close to everything, but enough that Senna had a number in an account with her name on it that meant she had options again. She was 29 years old. She drove back to Marlowe County on a Thursday in October. The leaves were turning, the specific burnt orange and deep red that part of North Carolina does in fall. And she turned off the highway, onto the county road, and then onto the gravel drive, and the house was still there, the way the house was always still there, solid and patient and waiting. She sat in the truck for a long time. Then she got out and walked around to the back and unlocked the workshop. It smelled like sawdust and linseed oil, the way it always had, the way it had smelled since she was 7 years old, and her father let her sand a chair leg and told her to always go with the grain, never against it, because the wood already knows what it's supposed to be. She found the end table where she'd left it, in the corner under a canvas drop cloth she'd put over it before she drove away 5 years ago. The left leg was still stripped, still waiting. She got out the tools. Here's what Prescott Okafor did not know, because people like Prescott rarely do the math on people they've underestimated. While Senna was in Asheville learning construction and real estate law and how courts actually work when you know how to read the filings, she'd also been buying property. Small things. A duplex in Buncombe County that needed a new roof. A single-family rental in Black Mountain that she fixed herself over 2 weekends and rented to a teacher and her daughter. A vacant commercial lot in Weaverville that everyone thought was too small to be worth anything, which turned out to be worth something once the town approved a zoning change 3 years later. She wasn't rich. She wasn't even close. But she understood something her father had tried to teach her, that wealth is not a number, it's a position. It's where you're standing when the opportunity arrives. The opportunity arrived the following spring. Prescott's financial situation, as it turned out, had not improved since the settlement. He'd made a series of decisions that people make when they believe money they didn't earn will keep coming. Bought a commercial property in Marlowe County's downtown block, took out a loan against it, couldn't sustain the payments when a tenant left and another didn't arrive. The property went into default. The bank filed the foreclosure paperwork on a Wednesday. By Friday, Senna had made an offer. She bought it through her LLC, Okafor Land Holdings, which was not a coincidence in name. The building was a 2-story structure on Clement Street, the main commercial block in Marlowe, that had a ground-floor retail space and 3 offices on the second floor. One of those offices had been Prescott's accounting practice for 11 years. His lease didn't expire for another 14 months. Her property manager, a steady woman named Tess, who handled all 3 of Senna's rental properties, sent the new lease terms in the mail. Standard letter. Professional language. The rent had increased by 40%, which was still $200 below market rate for that block, but Senna knew the number would land the way it would land. She wasn't there when Prescott received it. She didn't need to be. She'd learned from watching her father, and from 2 years in the Army, that you don't have to be in the room when a thing resolves itself. You just have to have put in the work before anyone else was paying attention. She heard about it from Kay, who heard about it from someone in the county recorder's office. Prescott had driven to the building, asked who the new owner was, and stood in the parking lot for a long time when he found out. Senna didn't feel triumphant exactly. She was 30 years old, standing in her father's workshop in the house that was hers again, sanding the left leg of an end table that had been waiting 5 years to be finished. She went with the grain. She always went with the grain. There is a thing that happens when someone who is supposed to be gone keeps showing up. Not in a haunting way, in a structural way. The way a load-bearing wall keeps standing even after someone's tried to tear it out and given up and assumed it was gone. Senna Okafor didn't take Prescott's calls. She wasn't cruel about it. She just didn't. She had Tess handle all communications regarding the property, the lease, the renewal options. She had no interest in a conversation. She had no speech prepared, no moment she was waiting to deliver. That's the thing about people who've actually been through something. They don't need the catharsis scene. The catharsis already happened, quietly, alone, when they decided to keep going. But one afternoon in late November, she was at the Clement Street property doing a walkthrough of the retail space. A bakery had just signed a lease, and she wanted to check the ventilation situation before they started build-out. And she came up the back staircase and walked past the door of Prescott's office, and the door was open. He was sitting at his desk. He looked older in the way that people look older when things haven't gone the way they expected. He saw her the same moment she saw him. Neither of them spoke for a moment. She had thought, sometimes, about what she would say if it came to this. She'd gone through versions in her head over the years. The version where she was cold. The version where she listed everything. The version where she asked him why. She'd discarded all of them. None of them were really for her. What she said was, "The ventilation inspection is Thursday. Make sure the hallway is clear." And she kept walking. Leonard Devereaux's law license was suspended 18 months after the journalist's piece ran. Not revoked. Suspended with conditions, which is the Bar Association's way of saying, "We see you without saying anything they'll have to stand behind in court." He retired to Hilton Head. Senna heard this from Kay, who was matter-of-fact about it, because Kay had been matter-of-fact about everything from the beginning, which was one of the reasons Senna trusted her. The journalist won a regional award for the series. She sent Senna a copy of the article, the original one, with a note that said, "Thank you for talking to me." Senna had talked to her once, for 37 minutes, in the parking lot of a Waffle House in Roxborough. She hadn't given her name. She didn't need her name in the story. The story was bigger than her name. The bakery on Clement Street opened in March. It was called Common Ground, which Senna thought was either the most obvious name for a bakery in a historically complicated southern town or the most correct one. The owner, a woman about 10 years older than Senna, had been trying to open it for 4 years and couldn't find a landlord willing to sign a lease with a new business. Senna had signed on the spot. The bakery had a line out the door by April. On a Saturday in late spring, Senna drove out to the house and sat on the wraparound porch with a cup of coffee and watched the light move across the field the way it does in the mornings. Slow, specific, unhurried, like it has somewhere to be but isn't anxious about getting there. The end table was in the living room. She'd finished it in November, the week after the walkthrough on Clement Street. She'd used the same stain her father used, a medium walnut that he'd bought by the quart, and kept on the second shelf of the workshop, and she'd rubbed it in with a cloth and let it sit and rubbed it again, the way he'd shown her, and when it was done, it looked exactly the way it should have looked 5 years ago. She'd put a lamp on it. One of his, a brass base with a cream shade that she'd found in a box in the root cellar, still in its original packaging, bought and set aside for a house he was planning to have for many more years. She thought about him the way she thought about him most mornings, not with grief exactly, not anymore. Something quieter. She thought about the compass in the drawer of her nightstand, Find Your Way Home, and about how he'd told her when she enlisted that the Army would teach her things the world wouldn't, and that she should learn everything it had to teach her, and then come back and use it here, in the place that knew her name. She had. It had just taken longer than either of them expected. A neighbor's dog came trotting up the drive, the way it did sometimes. She'd gotten to know the neighbors again in the months since she'd been back. The family to the east who kept chickens, the older woman to the west who had known her father, and told Senna, the first time they met, that Winston used to bring her vegetables from his garden and never asked for anything in return. He was a man who gave, she said. I hope you know that. Senna knew that. She finished her coffee. She went inside. She had 3 property inspections that afternoon and a call with Kay about a parcel in the next county that had come up for sale and might be worth looking at. She had work to do. She had always had work to do. She picked up her keys from the table by the door. The table her father had built. The table she had finished. The table that had waited in the corner of a workshop for 5 years until she was ready to come back and do what needed to be done. She locked the door behind her. She walked to her truck. She drove down the gravel drive and onto the county road, and this time she did look in the rearview mirror. The house was still there. It was always going to be still there. She drove toward the work.